So in this lesson, we start looking at international trade. Our last one, we looked at comparative advantage, which told us the measurement that countries should use to determine whether they need to be importers or exporters. And then now we're going to look at how that import-export work and the effect it actually has on the markets in which we trade. Okay, so let's look at imports-exports. So GDP, remember gross domestic product, is measured as consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. Net exports, of course, is the value of exports minus the value of imports. So imports and exports are a very, very important part of our GDP, but in a negative way. And you'll see why. Exports are the goods and services produced in the United States and sold to other countries. One of the things you notice, of course, if you were paying attention when we looked at unemployment in terms of wages and things, you saw that within jobs within the United States, there's very much a very, very small section of things that we actually produce anymore. For the most part, the United States economy is based on service jobs, and a lot of those service jobs are related to things that are within the United States. In other words, there are not a lot of things we export outside of the United States anymore. Rather, we see imports, and these are the goods and services produced from other countries. If you look at every single piece of clothing you have on right now, it's probably not made in the United States. More than likely, it was made in another country. Now, the company that made it might be an American company. For example, your iPhones and are produced by Apple, a company that is based in the United States. But the phones themselves are actually produced in Asia. So they are imported into the United States. Therefore, they count against our GDP, but they count favorably on our GNP. Now, when you look at this, what you're seeing here is the percentage of exports and imports, so the percentage of GDP that this makes up, exports and imports. Now, you'll notice that you'll see some imports there. For the most part, it's very close until we get into the present day. For the most part, the United States had a favorable net exports in which our exports were greater than our imports. It wasn't by a lot, but you can see where it was. Now, in 1945 to 1949, it was massive. Well, that's right after World War II, when European economies were rebuilding and we were selling them everything we possibly could. So since 1976, though, the United States has ran a trade deficit. When we put this line up here, you'll notice everything to the left of the line, for the most part, you see blue above red or blue equals red. So exports above imports, our imports and exports are equal. Since 1976, the United States has had a trade deficit in which imports are greater than exports. In particular, right at the turn of the 21st century, that gap, you'll notice, seemed to get much larger. In other words, and you'll notice pretty quickly there, you can see where our exports declined and our imports, they started to increase quite a bit more. So we're seeing a gap there between what we're importing and what we're exporting. And quite frankly, you would expect that in this country because, jobs in the United States are not based on the production of goods as so much as they are the delivery of services. And that's something that's really, really important that you understand, of course, moving forward as you look for jobs. Okay, let's look at the determinants of trade, which we just looked at last with our comparative advantage, and we're going to add another factor in here that helps us identify comparative advantage. So what determines whether a country imports or exports goods? Should a country import or export a specific good? Well, comparative advantage can be determined by prices. In other words, if we want to know if a country has a comparative advantage, we can look at the price to help us in that decision. So comparing the domestic price of a good to its world price. In other words, the domestic price, what is the price? What is the average price of that good here in the United States in that specific market versus the average price in the rest of the world, a global price? So if the domestic price is higher than the world price, you're going to import goods. In other words, you do not have a comparative advantage. If the domestic price is lower than the world price, then you become an exporter because you can sell below that world price and you're actually going to be able to generate more revenue because going up to that world price isn't going to affect you negatively. So you can see that by comparing domestic price to world price, you'll quickly figure out whether a country has a comparative advantage or not on a market of production of a certain good. So if a country has a competitive advantage, then its domestic price will be lower. And if a country does not have a comparative advantage, then the domestic price will be higher. Okay, let's look at the market for exports and see what happens here. So when a country has a comparative advantage, the domestic price is below the world price, and the country is an exporter. So what occurs in the market when you're an exporter? Well, world price acts as much like a price control. So if you understood how price controls work with price ceilings and price floors, you'll get this idea of what a world price is going to look like and how it's going to act in the market. For the world price equals a price floor when exporting. So you can think of exports as equaling surplus, which is exactly what's happening here, is that the firms can produce a surplus of the good that they are producing and then sell it overseas. And so it acts as a surplus. So world price equals a price floor when exporting, and it makes exports look much like it would a surplus. So world price equals a price ceiling when importing, and the imports look much like a shortage in the sense that when the world price is lower than equilibrium, firms can't produce as much. And so the deficit between quantity demanded and quantity supplied is made up by importing into the United States. And so we can look at this, and we'll use a hypothetical market for steel. Now, we can use steel in this sense because at the turn of the 20th century, the United States was one of the single largest steel producers on the planet. So at one point, we were a major steel exporter. Now, so here's our domestic demand, and here's our domestic supply. Now, notice that our prices are by 100,000. Our quantity is in millions, so we're going to have some large numbers working with. So our equilibrium here is $460,000. So that's the price. Okay, that's our domestic price. Now our world price is 550K. So domestic price is 90,000 below the world price. As a result, we are going to become exporters of steel. So firms, of which there are a bunch of firms in the United States, steel firms, are all going to be able to export steel into other countries. So here's the deal, and this is what you have to look at. A world price causes the price within the United States to increase, okay? So what's going to happen is when the United States begins to export steel, the price of steel in the United States will increase from 460,000 to 550,000. So the world price is going to cause our domestic price to increase. Now the domestic quantity demanded therefore falls. You'll notice when you look at equilibrium is at 5 million. Well, the domestic quantity demanded drops that to about 4.1. And so we can look here, the price paid by domestic consumers increases from 460,000 to 550,000, causing domestic quantity demanded to fall from 5 million to 4.1 million. Now on the other side, we can see here what happens with the firms. So domestic quantity supplied increases. So the increase to world price, so the increase from 460,000 to 550,000 creates an incentive for firms to increase production from 5 million to 6 million. So important to look at here. When the United States exports goods to another country, notice that consumers pay higher prices and thus buy less, but producers will produce more because now they have a market with which to sell that in. So the difference between domestic quantity supplied and domestic quantity demanded, whereas previously we would have called this a surplus, when talking about trade, it's exports. That's the amount that will be sold overseas. So the difference in domestic quantity demanded and domestic quantities supplied is sold abroad at exports. And the reason they can do that, of course, is because they were able to produce at a lower price, so they could increase production and still have those markets, so that instead of creating a surplus and having nowhere to go with it, now they can sell it overseas and make a tremendous amount of revenue. Okay, let's look at how exports impact total revenue. So how does the exportation of goods affect the total revenue of firms? So when we bring this back up and we look at it where we stopped at the last point, so we see where we're at, total revenue before trade is equal to a price, which is 460,000, times a quantity of 5 million. So total revenue is equal to $2.3 trillion for all firms in the market, not just one. That would be sweet if it was, but it's all firms across the market. So total revenue after trade, though, We take the new price, which is 550,000, times the quantity sold domestically, which is 4.1 million, plus the exports of 1.9 million. So as an exporter, domestic firms can sell all they produce abroad since their costs are lower. So when you look at that red dot there, that is where total revenue for producers in an exporting market comes from. So you'll notice they're able to sell 6 million at a price of 550,000. So as a result, the total revenue is equal to the world price of 550,000 times the amount that firms are willing and able to produce at that price, which is 6 million. So therefore, total revenue equals $3.3 trillion. In other words, when the United States has a comparative advantage in the production of steel and sells steel overwide in our hypothetical market here, U.S. firms make an enormous amount of profit. So they see a total revenue increase of 3.3 trillion minus whatever their total costs are, and then that equals their profit. So the firms increase total revenue by $1 trillion. So who does trade benefit when exporting? Well, to measure the gains and losses of trade, we can look at how trade impacts the consumer and producer surplus. So remember that exporting steel causes the price of steel to rise domestically, and exporting steel creates an increase in total revenue for firms. So when we pull it up and we look at it, and we have our domestic supply and we have our domestic demand, and we take our equilibrium, the consumer and producer surplus with no trade looks like this, which is what you've seen before. Now, the consumer and producer surplus with trade, though, looks like this. So notice that when we trade, the consumer surplus falls, whereas producer surplus increases fairly significantly to the tune, of course, $1 trillion in total revenue. So the increase in production in the producer surplus was worth $1 trillion in total revenue because we increased it by taking away part of the consumer surplus, but also then adding in the exports. So consumers lost while producers gained. However, economic well-being of the country increased as a whole, though. And that's the key point, is regardless of who, at the end of the day, regardless of who gains and who loses from trade within the country itself sees economic well-being increase. Okay, let's look at the market for imports now. So if the world price of a good is lower than the domestic price, the country should import because they do not have a comparative advantage. So what occurs in the market if you're an importer? Well, world price acts much like a price control. In this particular case, it acts like, of course, a price ceiling when importing because imports equal a shortage. What happens, of course, is firms aren't willing to supply as much and consumers are demanding more. So firms from outside of the United States will import to satisfy the consumer demand within the United States. So here's our domestic demand. Here's our domestic supply for steel. Now in this situation, of course, we said the United States is going to be importing as opposed to exporting. So we have this world price here, well, a domestic price here of $480,000. And now our world price is lower. World price is $400,000. So in this situation, we see a world price $80,000 less than the domestic price. And as a result, we do not have a comparative advantage and we should be importing. So world price is $80,000 below domestic price. Now the domestic quantity supplied falls as domestic producers are not willing or able to produce it as much at that price. So when the price goes down, the amount that the firms are willing to produce or able to produce falls. And so you can see that there when 400,000 causes us to fall from 4.5 million down to about 3.7. So this is our domestic quantity supplied. So 4.5 million with no trade to 3.7 with trade. So that's the fall in the domestic quantity supply, which obviously means they're going to see a fall in revenue. Now the domestic quantity demanded rises with the lower price though. So now we see where domestic quantity demanded has over here, it's increased. And so it's gone from 4.5 million with no trade to 5.1 million with trade. So domestic quantity supplied has fallen, domestic quantity demand has risen. The difference in those two is ultimately going to result in our imports. So the difference between domestic quantity demanded and domestic quality supplied is imported. So you can see there, that's our import amount. So in this case, 600,000 is going to be what's going to be imported because producers here in the country can't produce as much. So then that gives us to this next question, which is how do imports affect total revenue? So when we bring the graph up again and we look at it, what we're going to see is total revenue before trade is equal to the price of 400,000 times a quantity of 4.5 million. So total revenue is equal to 1.8 trillion across all firms. Now total revenue after trade, you'll see here that red dot is a price of 400,000 times a domestic quantity supplied at 3.7. So price fell, quantity supplied fell, therefore total revenue will fall. Firms will only sell all they produce, but they're only going to be willing to produce 3.7 million. So everything they produce is going to sell, but they're only going to be willing to sell 3.7 million. So total revenue with trade is equal to 1.480 trillion. As a result, firms lose 320 billion in revenue as a result of importing steel. So when the country is an importer, you'll see here firms lose revenue. Okay, so we want to ask this question, who does trade benefit with importing? So to measure the gains and losses of trade, we can look at how trade impacts the consumer and producer surplus, just like we did with exports. So remember that importing steel caused the price of steel to fall domestically, but importing steel creates a decrease in total revenue for firms as well. So when we pull it up and we look at the domestic demand and domestic supply, and we see where equilibrium is at, consumer and producer surplus with no trade at all looks like that. Now, when consumer and producer surplus occurs with trade, now it changes. With the world price, the producer surplus falls and the consumer surplus gains. So consumers gained from trade while producers lost. Economic well-being of the country increased as a whole, though, and that's the key, is even though trade creates a gain for one group and a loss for another, overall economic well-being of the country is increased. So you'll notice here the increase in consumer surplus cost producers 320 billion in total revenue, but the economy as a whole improved. So free trade and economic welfare. So countries with trade deficits see an overall market in which, you'll notice here, you see the United States, Spain, United Kingdom, these are the top 10 current account deficits. In other words, these are the top 10 countries that have a trade deficit. So countries with trade deficits see an overall market in which domestic producers are worse off. Have we lost jobs to other countries outsourcing them? Absolutely. Why? Because of trade. Now, the domestic consumers, though, are better off because what happens to prices? They go down. The quality of goods can increase, the amount of goods can increase. Now, trade raises the economic well-being of the nation as a whole because the gains of the consumers are greater than the losses of the producers. Okay, so trade raises the economic well-being of the nation as a whole because gains of consumers are greater than the losses of producers. So our examination at this point is focused on a free trade scenario. Everything we've done has been done without the creation of any sort of trade barriers. So no barriers have existed at all. So how do trade restrictions affect economic well-being? Because that's the next step we want to take, is what happens in that market when all of a sudden restrictions are placed on trade. So we want to look at tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on goods produced abroad and sold domestically. Now, another thing you can do is create import quotas, but we're not going to focus on those at the moment. We're rather just going to focus on our tariffs. And they're taxes on goods produced abroad and sold domestically. So the markets in which tariffs are enacted see prices rise above world price by the amount of the tariff. Not all markets in which goods are produced and sold within the United States have a tariff on them. Some markets would, some would not have it at all. And so this is a very specific tax on a good coming into the United States. And that good is then sees an increase in its price by whatever that tax amount is. Tariffs are a source of government revenue. So in one sense, tariffs exist simply to make the government money. But they also reduce the impact that the world price has on the revenue of firms. So you noticed in that last one, the world price caused a $320 billion decline in total revenue for firms across the market. A tariff would have the possibility of reducing that amount. So while firms still lose revenue as a result of the importation of goods, the loss of total revenue will not be as large. And so once they make their adjustments and get everything dealt with, what they're going to see is that they won't make as much total revenue as they have been in the past, but they're still going to make more than there would be if it was a free market. So tariffs were the primary source of revenue in the United States until the creation of income taxes during World War I. That is how we made the majority of our tax dollars. The reason why we changed in World War I is because the United States had been quickly becoming less of an importing country and more of an exporting country. Therefore, we weren't making as much money on the tariffs and needed a new source of tax revenue for the federal government. Thus, you had income taxes. So tariffs also served to protect fledgling U.S. industries from cheaper British goods during the 19th century. So throughout the 1800s, when the United States was developing its textile industry and the new industries within the United States, Britain had already done so a long time ago. So British goods were cheaper than American goods, and what would happen is British goods would flood into the markets. Consumers, of course, bought cheaper British goods, and in doing so, American firms were struggling to take off. So they were struggling to maintain employees, they were struggling to stay open. Tariffs raised those British prices up to higher levels, thus making the American goods, even though maybe they weren't as good a quality, from a price perspective, they were just as competitive, and so those firms were then able to develop and grow. This right here will show you the percentage of tariffs. So to give you an idea, you can notice there since 1820, you see a rise and fall in tariffs. So we noticed tariff abominations in 1828. Tariff levels were massively high. And this was the reason why it's called the tariff abominations, is because this was basically it was a political ploy that was backfired massively and ended up in creating this extremely largest tariff in American history. And then of course after that, you see that tariff rates began to decline and reach a low point in 1857. Now, one of the reasons why, of course, is because during this time period, the United States had become an extremely large cotton producer. We were exporting cotton. We were also developing so much of our own textiles that British imports coming into the country weren't making us a lot of money. Then you'll notice they shoot back up in 1861 to 64 during the Civil War. And at that time, the United States was using tariffs as a part of revenue to pay for the Civil War. And then they decline afterward, jump again, and then they fall again until 1913. Now the reason they fall until 1913, of course, is because that's the second industrial revolution for the United States. We're producing a lot of goods. We're becoming one of the larger economies on the planet, and we are exporting goods of the United States all over the planet, in particular steel. Then you'll see jumping up again up into the 1930s. Part of this is because of the fact that during the 1920s, you have World War I, which has an impact, but then after World War I, the 1920s with Republicans in power, they increased tariffs as an effort to try to make and protect newer American industries that were developing and to protect those against other countries. You'll see that they reach a height here in 1930, and then since then they've always been in decline. Trade Agreement Act in 1934 led to basically countries saying, okay, we'll decrease our tariffs if you decrease ours. So they would start to decrease them. And as a result, by now, tariffs hover around 5%. So let's look at how these tariffs impact the market. So tariffs serve one of two purposes, remember, and this is what we talked about. When we look at the market here and we see our supply and our demand, and we see where our world price is, we know, of course, that that world price is below the domestic, and therefore it's costing revenue for domestic firms. We look at the world price, and what we notice, of course, is tariffs are designed to raise revenue in one purpose, because by creating a tax, you can then tax the imports and make money off them. At the same time, though, they're used to protect domestic industries. You look at that $320 billion loss. Well, maybe those firms would like to see that loss go down quite a bit. Well, creating a tariff will serve that purpose. So in our previous example, firms lost $320 billion as a result of the importing of steel. They lobbied Congress for the creation of a tariff to reduce foreign steel imports. And this is a protective tariff because its only purpose here is to reduce their revenue. Now, is the government going to get revenue regardless? Yeah. Now, this would reduce the revenue loss of domestic firms. And so Congress passes a tariff of 10% on foreign steel. Now, we're going to use 10%. That would, of course, be $40,000. So we see the line here, our red line representing our tariff. At $440,000 is the new price, and that's that 10% tariff. So tariff raises the world price in the United States to $440,000. So its impacts. Well, let's kind of make this much larger so we can really get to looking at its impacts. So what we'll notice first is the domestic quantity supplied and domestic quantity demanded for our steel where the world price is. Now what's going to happen, of course, is when the tariff comes into play, now domestic quantity supplied increases, whereas domestic quantity demanded decreases. And so now we see these two red lines. So the domestic quantity supplied increased from 3.7 million to 4 million there. So you can see a $300,000 unit increase in those two green dots. Now, domestic quantity demanded fell from 5.1 to 4.7. So the supply went up, demand went down. So total revenue was 400,000 times 3.7 million equaling $1.48 trillion. That's what it was with the world price in place. Tariff now causes total revenue to become 440,000 times 4 million equaling 1.76 trillion. As a result, overall total revenue loss went from 320 billion to only 40 billion. So you can see how a tariff would impact the total revenue for American firms, because it's going to significantly reduce the total loss that they have. Now our imports were in blue here, so this is where our imports were, and then that's where they are now. So you'll notice, of course, that tariffs serve the purpose of reducing the amount of imports. So tariffs reduce the quantity of imports because it provides an incentive for domestic quantity to increase. Thus, firms can increase production and we don't need as many imports. So now let's look at the tax revenue and the deadweight loss. So tariffs generate tax revenue and deadweight losses. When we look at our graph here, we'll pull this back up and we can add a few more things to it. So tax revenue is equal to the amount of the tax times the quantity of imports. Well, the amount of the tax is that 10% tariff, which equals out, of course, to 40,000. Now, it represents that box there shaded in green because that's the amount of imports. So we take the amount of imports times that 40,000. So here we have it, 10% is equal to 40,000 times the quantity of imports, 4.7 times minus 4 million, so 700,000. And that gives us a $28 billion in tax revenue. So that's pretty good for the government. Now, the deadweight loss is the quantity of imports before the tariff minus the quantity of imports with the tariff. Those two red triangles there kind of help us represent what the deadweight loss looks like. So we take that amount times basically that 40,000, that gives an idea of how much total revenue is just lost as a result of the creation of this tariff. So the two right triangles shaded in red represent the two parts of our deadweight loss. So let's look at this economic well-being, of course, continuing with our consumer and producer surplus and looking at how the tariffs impact that surplus. So on the left, we see our consumer surplus with our world price, and notice, of course, that our world price has caused our consumer surplus to increase and thus producer surplus to fall. But on the right, what we'll notice here, of course, is that consumer surplus has now decreased a little bit and producer surplus has increased because of the tariff. So tariffs seek to improve producer surplus at the expense of some consumer surplus. And it also provides, of course, revenue for the government. So free trade has become increasingly the norm globally. You're starting to see a significant reduction, of course, in tariffs. We've already seen that tariffs now are on average about 5%. Import quotas and things of that nature are starting to go away. So since the end of World War II, countries have increasingly reduced trade barriers. What they're recognizing, of course, is what we were talking about, is that trade tends to benefit everyone together. So these are all of the different countries that the United States has a free trade agreement. You know, of course, probably the most well-known one is NAFTA, which we'll talk about here in a second. But notice all of the different countries in which the United States has a form of free trade agreement in place. And so the more countries you add to that list, the more countries overall tend to benefit people. So when we look at the major benefits of trade, so you'll see here the nations of the world are divided into 4 groups based on their trade freedom scores in the 2013 Index of Economics Freedom. And so the chart below shows that nations with more free trade also have these. So notice here stronger economies. Look at the top 1/4 there. huge difference. So average per capita gross national income, 32,579, and that top versus that bottom number down there of 3,528, which these are countries which just are very isolated from a trade perspective. There's also less hunger involved. Notice the difference there, 7.3 versus 17.6 in terms of a hunger score. And then the better care of the environment in terms of the environmental performance index. So what it tells us is that trade isn't just something about that's helping us in terms of cash flow, which it does, but also it makes food more accessible and also leads to a less pollution because of it being more distributed. Can you imagine if the United States produced all of its own goods within the U.S., how much pollution there would be? So the most noticeable, most recognizable free trade agreement for the U.S. is NAFTA, began in 1993. It's the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's with Mexico and with Canada. And so it allowed free trade between those three countries. And since the inception of NAFTA, Mexican imports to the U.S. have risen to over $220 billion a year, where U.S. imports to Mexico have risen to over $150 billion a year. So it has helped on both ends. Now, a lot of industrial workers and things like that, they are not in favor of free trade agreements simply because of the fact that it makes outsourcing easier. One of the things is, if you look at it, when NAFTA was created over the kind of the next 10 years after the inception of NAFTA, you saw a lot of countries moving their base of operations into Mexico, primarily because then they could sell goods into the United States without any sort of barriers, plus the fact that they could pay workers less in Mexico than they could here in the United States. The other one is this GATT, is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it refers to a continuing series of negotiations among many of the world's countries to promote free trade. It's taken tariffs down from 40% after World War II to about 5% today. And so what we see, of course, is that when we look at this international trade, it's benefiting everyone involved. It's based on comparative advantage, which is able to be measured through domestic versus world prices. All countries are importing and exporting of different goods. No matter what they're doing, that you see an overall rise in economic well-being because of the fact that the gains from trade are greater than the losses.